Hello, if I can ask you all to please take your seats. So it's my absolute honor to introduce the next storyteller, the first one of our day, Mr. David Shukman, who just participated in our first panel. I hope you enjoy it as much as I know I will.
Hey, thanks very much indeed. Great to be here. It's a huge pleasure. You know, there are lots of conversations here at COP28 and generally where we all ask each other, are you hopeful? Are you optimistic? What do you think is going to happen? And people often ask me if I'm giving a talk, can you please end on an optimistic note? Or people say to me, you seem to be quite an optimistic guy. What's that all about? And it's made me reach back through the years to earlier parts of my life to understand what shaped my outlook. Why do I have quite an optimistic kind of outlook? So I'd like to take you back in a sort of time machine to the 1980s. I know for some here that's kind of the dark ages, but the 1980s was when I was a young reporter. And I want to take you specifically to the streets of Northern Ireland during what were called the Troubles. It was a long period, a terrible period for Northern Ireland, with almost every day there were bombings, there were shootings, and there were lots of riots. And one day my editor said, he looked around the newsroom and his eye fell on me. He said, we're getting reports of a bad riot and I want you to go. So I reached into the drawer of my desk, took out my flak jacket, because us reporters were targets in those days. I'm putting the straps on of this jacket. And then the editor said, oh, one more thing. And he carried across the newsroom this heavy object and he put it down in front of me. And he said, I want you to take this. It was what he called a mobile telephone, right? This was 1986, and I had never seen this thing, a mobile telephone. So I said, okay, I'll take it off to the riot. So I carried this thing. 5 kilos it weighed, all right? 5 kilos. Put it in the car, got to the riot, took this thing out of the car, got to the riot. At one end of the street, a big crowd of young guys chucking rocks and petrol bombs. At the other end of the street, soldiers, police in their armored vehicles and whatever. And I found my cameraman, and I found some other reporters, and immediately they all said, what the hell is that thing you brought with you? And I said, well, it's a new thing called a mobile telephone. Quite quickly, I had a throng of people around me. I realized there were soldiers, there were police. They wanted to see, what's this thing? Someone said, oh, it's like out of a James Bond film. I mean, not that I was James Bond, but this gadget was James Bond. And then I realized a few of the young lads from the riot had also joined this group. I had 100 people around me looking at this new, amazing gadget called a mobile telephone. And after a while, there came the moment when I had to use it. So I picked up the handset and I pushed the buttons, and I actually got through to the newsroom in Belfast. And you know what happened? I could hear them, but they couldn't hear me. And instantly, what had been the source of admiration, adulation, people a bit envious of me, pivoted to a moment of abject humiliation, where I was kind of ridiculed. This is ridiculous. This BBC guy turns up with this mobile thing and it doesn't work. Now, I now realize, with the benefit of hindsight, that I was at the bottom of what economists call an S-curve. When a new technology is introduced, and for a long time, it's crap. It doesn't work, and it's very expensive. Nobody wants these things, right? But then, on the S, you get the steep bit, where suddenly, dramatically, stuff which never worked, was unpopular, becomes incredibly popular and cheap. You know, within 5 years of my humiliation on the streets of Northern Ireland with this useless mobile phone, every BBC reporter had a mobile. 5 years after that, I bought my first mobile for my oldest child. 5 years after that, my mum, then in her 70s, bought her first mobile. I mean, within an astonishingly short space of time, everybody had a mobile. They'd gone from being expensive and useless to cheap and useful. And we're seeing exactly that with solar panels, with batteries, with electric cars, with wind. When I started reporting on climate change 20 years ago, these things were expensive and didn't work very well. Now they're really much, much cheaper and they work well. We're on the S-curve, the steep bit. So when I think of optimism and possibility, at least when it comes to technology, we're witnessing something amazing, where basically what seemed implausible suddenly becomes plausible. Yes, we can technically have a cleaner, greener, safer future. We have the tech. Okay, Bill Gates would have you believe that the tech is all there is. But we all actually know that's not the case. It's tech on one side, essential, absolutely. But on the other side, it's people, right? What do people do? How do people behave? I've just lost my time clock, by the way. So I don't know where this is going to go. Let's see. So the other side is people. So let's stick with the 1980s, and you're very good to bear with me. Let's go 3 years after my humiliation with the riot and the mobile phone and all of that. 1989, I was sent by the BBC to Berlin, now the capital of Germany. And back in those days, in fact, for my entire life up to that point, all through the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, Europe had been divided by the Iron Curtain. You had the communist East and you had the West. And the regimes running the East did not want their people escaping to the West because it was bad for their reputation. And the toughest part of the Iron Curtain was in Berlin with the Berlin Wall. In fact, the Berlin Wall was 3 parallel walls, massive structures with barbed wire and armed guards and dogs and floodlights, and it was a really hostile boundary. People who tried to cross often got shot. It was an ugly scar dividing Europe, and here's the key thing. Throughout the first half of my life, it was something that just seemed permanent. The idea that this wall would ever go seemed inconceivable. One night in East Berlin, the terrible old guys who were running that really quite evil and oppressive regime were under pressure. There were some demonstrations, there were some protests, too big for them to put down and suppress. So they lobbed out some concessions. You can do this, you'll be a bit freer here. And one night I was at a briefing with the East German ministers, and one of these old guys said, "Oh, I'm announcing that there are going to be some new arrangements where to make it a bit easier for you East Berliners to visit West Berlin." Right? So this was big news, because up until then, no one in the East could visit the West. Word of this announcement spread like wildfire through East Berlin. And within a few hours, a lot of young East Berliners had gathered at the only crossing point, a place called Checkpoint Charlie. It's where people like me from the West could come into East Berlin, and it was the only possibility for getting out. But none of them had permission. They'd been told there would be new arrangements where they could get visas and that they would eventually be allowed to visit the West. Well, let me tell you, the young people of East Berlin that night had the same attitude that Greta Thunberg has when she says, these COPs, these conferences, it's all blah, blah, blah. They'd run out of patience with blah, blah, blah. They gathered at the red and white pole that was the barrier, right? They were there, first a few hundred, I was there filming this, then a few thousand, then lots of thousands of people. And they edged towards the barrier. Now, there were armed guards there. Everybody knew you could get shot for trying to cross. But there was something in the air that night. There was something in the determination of the young people, fed up with living in an oppressive regime, fed up with being told what they couldn't do, fed up with being told what wasn't possible. And a few brave guys at the front got closer and closer to the barrier. They could see into the west. They looked into the eyes of the young border guards with their guns, and they faced them down. There was momentum that night, a kind of unstoppable surge of people, which meant that the guys at the front lifted the barrier. The border guards stood back. They didn't know what to do. The young guys advanced to the next barrier. They lifted it. And what happened that night began as a trickle of very brave young people, followed by a stream, followed by a torrent of what hit me in a kind of exhilarating way. As young people not just choosing a better future, but seizing a better future, and with positivity and with joy and with happiness and excitement, they flowed through out of the oppressive East German regime into the greater freedom of the West. At that night, those young people effectively ended the Cold War. They ended the division of Europe. The next night, more crossing points were opened. Within a few months, the Berlin Wall started to be demolished entirely. If you go to Berlin, it's a beautiful city, I recommend it, you can find little bits of the wall that have been left as a tourist attraction. There's a little remnant of Checkpoint Charlie, that famous crossing point. There's an actor put into some kind of military uniform. You can pose beside them, right? What, for most of my life up to that point, had been this ugly, forbidding, permanent structure was wiped off the map by people power, by young people just saying, we've had enough of this. And I think the parallels right now, for me, are very powerful. Young people, and we've talked about this, young people in big organizations, young people acting in groups on their own, young people doing their own thing in schools and companies and big organizations, just saying, I don't like the blah, blah, blah. I'm fed up with people telling me what I can't do. And like those East Berliners, what gives me a lot of hope is young people just saying, I'm not putting up with this anymore. I'm going to seize that better future. And it seems to me that if you put together the incredible journey we've come on technologically, where very rapidly, far more rapidly than anyone predicted, you go from a reporter lugging a 5-kilo mobile phone that doesn't work, to mobile phones everywhere, to electric solar panels everywhere, wind, electric cars. 4 out of 5 cars sold in Shanghai now are electric. So many cars are electric in China that China's biggest oil company has said that oil demand in China has peaked. We've crossed a tipping point. Now you put that together with the determination, the energy, the desire for a saner, safer future. A future where there's not so much asthma. This is terrible air today, right? If you're an asthma sufferer. You can put these things together and people can say, yeah, when they ask me, why are you optimistic? Are you optimistic? I look at what happened that night in Berlin. I look how far we've come with technology. We have the tools, we have the will. Let's put them together. And people ask me, are you optimistic? And I say yes. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Great. I'd love to take questions if that's allowed, but anyway, let's see where we go. Okay. I mean, are there questions? I just suddenly thought, I'd love to hear from you. Particularly young people. I don't believe that. I'd love to know what you think. Did what I say kind of resonate in any way? Does it work?
Do you think this can relate to climate change, as in, for now, we think that so many things are impossible. Do you think that the Berlin Wall of climate change will break down one day?
Yes. I mean, look, if the Berlin Wall could be demolished by the power of young people, and if what seemed like implausible technologies suddenly become very, very plausible, put those two together, and yes. So the equivalent of the Berlin Wall is the fossil fuel industry, right? Right now, today, with the 2,500 lobbyists here in the blue zone doing their thing, slowing it all down, that's a Berlin Wall. Did the Berlin Wall get knocked down? It's possible. I don't want to put the pressure on your generation, but it's possible.
Yes, I believe youth is really the future of all of us, and we should speak more about this as young people. And I really like how COP has really focused on us youth. Alhamdulillah.
Yeah, fantastic. Congratulations.
Thank you again for sharing. I have a question actually. So activism and protests are a great way to, make your voice heard, affect change. But how can we also encourage intergenerational dialogue between younger people and people who are more senior? That is not necessarily just younger people protesting and saying, "Oh, you're endangering our future."
So I think wherever there's a venue for dialogue where you can bring people together, I think is incredibly valuable. I mean, I would like to be on a panel someday with a head of ExxonMobil and a climate scientist and a youth activist. Why not? The head of Exxon wouldn't want to do it, but nevertheless, I mean, you know where I'm going with this. I think the future is precisely to break down barriers, to get dialogues going between people who wouldn't normally talk to each other. Very often it's the corporate world that are most nervous at that because they don't want to get hard questions from the likes of you. But I think that's the way forward, and I would love to see more of that if we can make it happen.
100%. Is there any advice that you would give to younger folks on how to tell their stories better and at the same time affect change?
So I think to use images, mental images. What for you, when you think of an image of climate change, your own experience of it, what is it? I was talking to these young climate diplomats and did some training for them. And they all had powerful stories. A guy from Fiji who's now on their delegation, he talked about how terrible, how moved he was to see 3 young boys on the roof of their house during a flood. The trauma those kids are going to suffer because of climate change. Using powerful imagery like that cuts through to people in my experience. And I also think if you're in a big organization like you are, there's no reason, if you want, but every opportunity to bring it up. Every meeting. You'll become the office bore, right? And maybe unpopular, but we're running out of time, right? So every meeting. Because people say, oh, we'll have a talk about sustainability, right, over here. And then all this other stuff goes on about business plans and whatever, and they don't think about sustainability over there. My point is it's core. Thinking sustainably is core to every business activity. So whenever anyone gets the chance, in whatever organization you're in, ask, oh, what are we doing about this? We're building a new office block. Right. Is it using green cement? Is it using green steel? What are the arrangements for aircon? How are we going to keep this building cool? What are the heating arrangements? What about provision for electric cars? What about public transport? Right? I mean, I think transitions are ugly. There are winners and losers. And it's the time now, I think, not to be too cozy and consensual and comfortable. I've seen too many gatherings here that are all kind of nice and people get an easy ride. Awkward questions. I know a company where they were very proud. They announced, oh, we've got 2 EV charging points in our car park, right? Well, it turned out the 2 senior guys in the company both had Teslas, right? So every morning they would drive in, right, and plug in, and the company would pay for their power. But I mean, that's useless, right? young person should call that out and say, well, hang on, what are you doing for public transport? Are you laying on electric buses for us to get to the bus stop or to the station? Are you laying on cheap loans so that others who aren't the bosses can buy electric cars, and more charging points? I mean, so I think calling out, being a bit disruptive, you take a risk, but I think there's a lot of power in your hands. Think of those East Berliners and the red and white pole. They crossed the line. Good luck. There was a question there, but we run out of time. Hey, I love these questions, so thank you. Okay. No. Shut me up when you have to.
Hi. Sorry.
Yeah.
Something I wanted to share is I feel in a lot of corporate and even in schools, we address climate change the way we address mental health. Like we'll have one meeting about it, one seminar about it, one discussion, and then you never treat the root of the cause, you just treat the symptoms. Like something interesting is in my university, I'm not gonna name it, but in my university, there's a lot of, they replaced the plastic cups with paper cups, and it was heralded as this big change, as this big step. But transport is very difficult to my university. The only way to come is through like sitting in traffic for 3 hours, and it's a lot of pollution, a lot of like they don't take any of the big steps. They take the small steps, and then they're very loud about it to kind of cover up for all the major missteps that they're taking. And as a student, how do you think I can approach my my superiors, the authority that's handling everything?
So I'm not going to pretend this is easy, because human nature is to avoid trouble, right? But I would say strength in numbers. So can you find like-minded students who maybe form a little club, form a little group, and kind of work out what you're comfortable with together? And maybe there's a letter to the head of the university. Maybe you try to arrange a kind of sustainability event or day and ask the heads of the university to come and speak. Would they do that? And maybe raise these things. I would suggest in your situation, gently at first. I wouldn't go in guns blazing, right? But gently. But I think if you can kind of get a sense of engagement going and a dialogue, and so that the senior guys are kind of getting a sense that you care, because they might not know that you care.
The issue here is not a lack of dialogue. There's certainly dialogue, but the issue is that there's only dialogue. When it comes to any concrete action, any action at all, it immediately fiddles up. Like there is a lot of dialogue. There's a lot of discourse. There's a lot of green stickers everywhere, but there's no actual work put into it.
So how about this? Yes. So how about this for a suggestion? With your contemporaries, you work out a wish list, right? Should the university lay on better transport for you, right? If it's a bus, should it be electric, right? How often should it run? I mean, in the canteen where you get your lunch, is it vegan? Is there a vegan option, or is it all meat? I mean, these are things where you could make a list of climate-friendly things that would make a difference, and then just work out how to raise them. Because I think if you go from dialogue, I totally get it. Dialogue is blah, 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 right? But it's a starting point. And out of that, having built the dialogue, then you can sharpen it slightly with a little wish list. Right? What is the biggest deal for you? Is it getting to by the sounds of it, it's how you get to and from the university, right? What would be the best way to do that? Is it an electric bus?
Right now, I'm taking 3 different forms of public transport.
Okay, that's grim.
But it takes me up to like 3.5 hours to reach home.
All right, well that's, are there others in the same situation?
There's not, because of this situation, everyone only in that, they only have students from that city. I'm coming from a different city.
Okay.
And so that's...
So you got an additional problem just trying to get to the college. Well, I mean, I think it goes back to the same point. Identify what would make your life better and more sustainable. and see if you can engineer a response from them. That's the kind of thing that would make a difference. But I mean, if you go from the dialogue is the starting point, and then within that, then you start having your demands, and go way beyond the plastic cups. I've told companies, don't send me a press release about plastic cups. You know, that's just nothing, right? So I think you're quite right to identify that as a weakness and then build on it. Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you so
Okay, great. All right, hey, thank you for your questions. Thank you.